For much of modern history, the Arctic was treated as a distant frontier, strategically important, but economically marginal and operationally thin. That perception is now outdated. Canada is no longer approaching the Arctic as an abstract space to be defended, but as a corridor to be built. Quietly, through a portfolio of northern roads, ports, air links, logistics hubs, and enabling infrastructure, Ottawa has been embedding access, presence, and governance into its own territory. By the end of 2025, this effort had reached a scale measured not in individual projects, but in cumulative commitment. The significance of this shift is not confrontation or control of sea lanes, but irreversibility. Once infrastructure is built into the ground, authority follows design. That is why this Arctic corridor matters, and why it cannot be meaningfully stopped from the outside. Welcome to Geo Capitalist, where global power is examined through infrastructure, trade corridors, and long-term economic design. Today's analysis focuses on Canada's $56 billion Arctic corridor Russia can't stop, understood not as a single route, but as a portfolio of nation-building investments reshaping northern access, logistics, and governance. This is a structural story about endurance, systems, and how infrastructure quietly determines outcomes long after political debates fade. Canada's Arctic strategy has shifted because the region is no longer viewed as a distant frontier defined by remoteness and episodic presence. Instead, it is increasingly treated as a corridor that connects resources, communities, and national systems across vast distances. A frontier invites sporadic attention and symbolic claims, while a corridor demands continuity, maintenance, and integration. This distinction matters because corridors are built to function every day, not just during moments of tension or opportunity. In practical terms, this means prioritizing year-round access, reliable logistics, and institutional presence rather than seasonal activity. Roads, ports, air links, and digital connectivity transform geography into usable space, allowing economic and administrative systems to operate consistently. When the Arctic is framed as a corridor, it becomes part of the national economy rather than an external edge. Movement of goods, people, data, and authority follows predictable pathways, reducing uncertainty and dependence on ad hoc solutions. This reframing explains why infrastructure sits at the center of Canada's northern approach. Corridors are not about speed or spectacle. They are about permanence. Once established, they shape behavior, investment decisions, and governance by default, anchoring long-term presence through function rather than assertion. The $56 billion figure associated with Canada's Arctic corridor does not refer to a single construction project or a finished route. It represents an aggregated portfolio of nation-building investments spread across multiple years, programs, and regions. These include northern transportation links, port and airport upgrades, community access roads, logistics facilities, and enabling infrastructure that supports both civilian life and state operations. Some projects are explicitly Arctic-focused, while others connect northern regions more tightly to southern supply chains and export networks. Together, they form a cumulative commitment rather than a standalone initiative. This portfolio approach is important because it reflects how infrastructure is actually built in challenging environments. Incremental projects compound over time, gradually reducing isolation and increasing reliability. Funding is layered through federal programs, territorial partnerships, and long-horizon planning frameworks rather than announced as a single headline sum. The result is a corridor system that emerges through integration rather than completion. By framing the investment this way, Canada avoids overstating progress while still signaling durable intent. The scale matters not because it promises immediacy, but because it embeds northern connectivity into long-term national planning. Canada's Arctic corridor is being assembled through interlocking investments rather than a single construction sequence. All-season roads extend reliable ground access to communities and resource zones that were previously reachable only intermittently. Port upgrades improve offloading capacity and seasonal reliability, while airport enhancements expand year-round logistics and emergency reach. These physical assets are complemented by digital connectivity, surveillance, and navigation systems that allow authorities to monitor movement, manage safety, and coordinate supply flows across vast distances. Crucially, each element is designed to connect with existing southern networks, ensuring that northern activity is not isolated but integrated into national supply chains. This assembly process prioritizes redundancy and flexibility, acknowledging that Arctic conditions demand multiple pathways rather than single points of failure. Progress is incremental, but cumulative. Each completed segment lowers operational risk and encourages further investment, both public and private. Over time, the corridor emerges as a functioning system, not because it reaches a ceremonial endpoint, but because enough links exist to make routine activity possible. This is how infrastructure creates presence. By building compatibility between assets and institutions, Canada turns geography into a managed space where movement, planning, and governance can operate continuously rather than episodically. The phrase, "Russia can't stop," does not imply confrontation, exclusion, or control over international waterways. It refers to limits on external influence over domestic infrastructure decisions. Canada's Arctic corridor is being built entirely within its own territory, governed by its laws, budgets, and institutions. No external actor, including Russia, possesses a veto over where Canada builds roads, upgrades ports, or expands logistics capacity in the north. This distinction is critical. The corridor does not depend on access through contested sea lanes or foreign-controlled choke points. Its effectiveness comes from internal connectivity and governance rather than transit dominance. As infrastructure accumulates, it becomes self-reinforcing. Communities plan around it, services rely on it, and economic activity adapts to its presence. External pressure cannot reverse these dynamics without direct interference, which lies outside normal statecraft. In this sense, the corridor's resilience is structural, not strategic. It does not challenge other Arctic models directly, but it proceeds independently of them. That is why it cannot be meaningfully stopped. It advances through domestic design choices that remain insulated from external approval or obstruction. Infrastructure changes power dynamics because it introduces irreversibility into decision-making. Once roads, ports, airfields, and logistics systems are built, economic behavior adjusts around them, and reversing course becomes costlier than continuing forward. In the Arctic, this effect is amplified by distance, climate, and scarcity of alternatives. Each completed asset reduces uncertainty, lowers operating costs, and encourages long-term planning by governments, communities, and firms. Over time, activity clusters around reliable corridors, reinforcing their importance regardless of short-term political debate. This is why infrastructure functions as a form of quiet authority. It does not require declarations or enforcement to shape outcomes. It does so by making certain patterns of movement and investment more practical than others. Canada's Arctic corridor follows this logic. By embedding connectivity into the northern landscape, it creates a path dependency that favors continued presence, service delivery, and economic use. The significance lies not in any single project, but in cumulative effect. Once enough links exist, the corridor becomes the default framework through which the region operates. At that point, external actors cannot meaningfully alter its trajectory because the incentives to maintain and expand it are internal and self-reinforcing. From a strategic perspective, Canada's Arctic corridor operates on a different axis than Russia's Arctic posture. Russia's advantages in the region are largely maritime and export-oriented, centered on controlling and monetizing shipping routes that serve global trade flows. Canada's approach, by contrast, is inward-facing. It focuses on domestic connectivity, governance, and integration of northern regions into the national economy. These two models coexist, rather than collide. Canada's corridor does not depend on access through Russian-influenced waters, nor does it attempt to challenge Russia's control over its own Arctic routes. Instead, it reduces Canada's exposure to external leverage by strengthening internal capacity. For policymakers in Washington, this distinction matters because it illustrates how Arctic influence can be built without confrontation. For Russia, it means there is little practical ability to obstruct a strategy grounded in domestic infrastructure and governance. The result is parallel development rather than direct competition, with each system advancing according to its own logic and constraints. Canada's Arctic corridor aligns with a broader national preference for long-horizon planning over rapid deployment. Large, complex environments reward patience, sequencing, and institutional continuity rather than speed. Northern infrastructure must be designed to operate across decades, withstand environmental stress, and support multiple policy objectives simultaneously, including economic development, service delivery, and security presence. This makes incremental build-out not a weakness, but a strength. Each project is evaluated not only for immediate return, but for how it fits into a wider system that evolves over time. The corridor approach also integrates northern communities into planning rather than treating them as endpoints. Reliable access improves cost structures for health, education, and utilities, reinforcing population stability and economic participation. Because these benefits accumulate gradually, they are less vulnerable to political turnover. Success is measured in reduced friction and increased predictability rather than visible milestones. This planning philosophy explains why the Arctic corridor has progressed without dramatic announcements. It reflects a model in which governance is exercised through design choices embedded in infrastructure, allowing strategy to persist even as policy debates shift elsewhere. In that sense, the corridor is not an exception, but a natural extension of how Canada manages complex, long-duration national projects. The emergence of a Canadian Arctic corridor signals a broader transformation in how the Arctic economy is likely to function. As infrastructure reduces isolation, the region becomes less dependent on episodic activity and more capable of supporting routine economic and administrative flows. This changes investment calculus. Firms plan for continuity rather than extraction windows, and governments can coordinate services with greater confidence. The corridor also reframes the Arctic as a space governed by systems rather than symbolism. Control is exercised through logistics, standards, and access, not declarations or maps. For other Arctic and near-Arctic states, the implication is clear. Influence increasingly flows from the ability to design and maintain corridors that integrate territory into national and regional economies. This favors states willing to commit resources over long periods and accept gradual progress. Canada's approach demonstrates that Arctic development does not require dominance of international routes to matter strategically. By focusing inward and building outward from domestic foundations, a country can shape outcomes quietly. Over time, these systems define how the Arctic is used, managed, and understood. Canada's Arctic corridor is not a single project, a finished route, or a geopolitical challenge issued outward. It is a portfolio of infrastructure decisions that embed access, governance, and continuity into the northern landscape. The $56 billion figure matters because it reflects sustained commitment rather than short-term ambition. Roads, ports, air links, and logistics systems do more than move goods. They anchor presence and shape behavior over time. This is why the corridor cannot be meaningfully stopped from the outside. Infrastructure built within national territory does not depend on external approval once it exists. In the Arctic, where endurance outweighs speed and design outlasts intention, the quiet accumulation of corridors often determines how power is exercised long before it becomes visible. And there you have it. If you found this breakdown valuable, watch our next video. It connects directly to what's unfolding, and don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us decode these global shifts without compromise. This was Canada's $56 billion Arctic corridor. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.